Hey, welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast.
We are absolutely thrilled you took the time to take a listen today and to join us as we talk about some important matters. Our goal every week as we do these podcasts is to bring the Lordship of Jesus Christ to life and to show how relevant, how real, how powerful the gospel is to impacting our everyday lives. And we've been in a great series on counterfeit modes of redemption. We're going to get back to that in just a moment, but we've got a big week at Living Stones, and I thought maybe we should pause. If you're a Living Stones family or you're in the neighborhood, maybe you could take part in some of these great events we've got coming.
Well, first of all, yesterday we had an awesome day of decorating. We take Christmas very seriously at Living Stones Church, particularly Christmas trees.
Yeah, we mentioned Sunday. I think we have 30 plus trees. I don't know if it's increasing. But we don't worship Christmas trees. We worship Jesus. But boy, the beautiful, transformation of the building is amazing.
And on that point, I grew up in a very minimalistic family, and typically, I don't want to speak for all Asians, but many Asian families that I've experienced are very minimalistic in terms of decor and just functionality. And what I've learned growing up for myself, and I'm trying to do with my family, is that traditions and festivities and stuff actually builds the identity of your kids. It really helps help them find a sense of a tradition, like I belong to someone, I'm part of something, So we establish different traditions, and we try to deck it out for our family during Christmas time more. So I appreciate that part about our church. I know there's a lot of work. We had so many people come out yesterday.
And I just want to say thank you, because we had, there's probably over 100 people that come out throughout the day.
Throughout the day, it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
And
but you're right. When you walk, the Christmas is an amazing time where we celebrate, of course, the birth of Jesus, and where would we be without the incarnation, without Christ coming and being born and then going on to die and be resurrected and ascended to the Father's right hand. I mean, this is the beginning of the amazing story of our redemption. And when you drive up, you see the windows at Living Stones, the big glass windows, and inside our foyer, it's just absolutely spectacular. Yeah. So we encourage you, come on out. In fact, this Friday, we have our Christmas market, family market, I believe that's what we call it, and we have different vendors come out, fun things, I talked to whole Tom and Chelsea. They're making macarons. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm going there just to buy some macarons. Chelsea's macarons are amazing. So. Anything she makes is amazing. Yeah. Of course, she's a French pastry chef and a trained chef. Yeah. Amazing. Whatever she touches is incredible.
Yeah, that's the scoop I get as a pastor. Like, who's making what? All right, I'm going to get there first. So you don't want to miss it. It's going to be amazing.
You don't want to miss it because we got the inside track and we know what amazing food
I don't know. I don't remember anything else. So I'm sure there are some other things that's going to be there. Pastor Susie knows more, but that's all I heard. So
also, as this is airing on Thursday morning, of course, the Supreme Court hearing on a major landmark abortion case is happening right now as we speak. Please keep that in your prayers. This could be the beginning of the unraveling of Roe v. Wade. Is certainly something we need to be praying for. So spend some time on your knees and let's ask God for mercy and for justice to be done and just to see the scourge of abortion lifted off of our nation. So please be praying about that. We'll probably talk about that in upcoming podcasts.
Now that decision won't come till June, correct?
Right. This is just the oral arguments, things like that.
It takes them 6 months to make this type of decision.
Oh, yeah.
Supreme Court.
Anyway, so let's get back. We have been talking about, and let me just, a lot of you have told me, hey, Pastor, let us know some good books you guys are reading, because I want to continue to do that. This book here is where our discussion is flowing from. It's a book by Chuck Colson and Nancy Pearcey called How Now Shall We Live. I really believe it's one of the finest Christian worldview books that's ever been written. And that's becoming a kind of our skeleton as we talk about counterfeit forms of redemption. And in other words, you have to have an answer. Everyone has to have an answer for how we got here, why the world is so messed up, and thirdly, how do you fix it? And that's basically talking about redemption and bring us up to speed, because we've talked about a number of counterfeit
redemption
forms.
Through materialism, through money and buying things. We talk about through statism, letting the government be our savior. That's a big thing right now.
Yep.
Salvation through sex,
yep.
Sexuality expression. It sounds so weird, but if you really think about them, that's exactly the message that's that's being pushed on us right
now. And these
now.
are all, these are all counterfeit forms of redemption that are all finding expression today. We're in Christmas season. Mega push that, if you want to be happy, buy this, or get the perfect gift, or you deserve it, all that kind of radical, consumeristic stuff.
Redemption through progress. Talk about Marxism, through throwing off the oppressors, finding redemption through that. All these are just popular replacement for the true redemption.
And this is what I love about the study of worldview, and I really encourage you to dive in more, because we're talking about things that are so relevant now, and yet these ideas have been around for centuries, for millennia. It really is, the Bible says there's nothing new under the sun, and it really is true, because these counterfeit forms of redemption keep popping up all throughout history. And like you said, we could pinpoint all of these finding expression in our culture today as we speak. That's how relevant the Bible is. That's how relevant Christian worldview is. So we're going to talk about a counterfeit form of redemption today, which is science. In fact, I was sharing with Pastor Andrew before we came up here. Dr. Fauci was on a national interview in which he made this statement. He said, "I am science." Here's this little gray-haired man that we've seen for the last 2 years, who in his white lab coat, who has been the face of basically our scientific approach to how we handle this COVID epidemic. And for him to make a statement that he is science, that's like you and I saying, "I am humility," or "I am the embodiment of whatever virtue," or whatever thing. I mean, it's laughable if it were not so ridiculous. But the fact of the matter is, almost single-handedly, this man has been the face under the guise of science. He has been empowered by the American populace, who we love. We love science. That whatever Dr. Fauci says, or whatever the National Institutes of Health say, that must be the gospel. That's the truth. That's the way, the truth, and the life for us. And it's amazing to me that pretty much he has been the face of policy that has impacted the lives of 330 plus million Americans, and all under the guise of science.
Yeah, and so allow me a moment to talk about that comment. Now, I didn't watch that interview. I don't know the context. I stay away from mainstream media, like I stay away from many other things. So I didn't watch that. But I'm guessing, again, I don't know the context. I'm guessing when he says this, it was affiliating himself like in an authoritative way, like what I'm speaking. Science is speaking. Maybe that's the if that's not, it's not. I'm sorry, but if that's the context, man, that is messed up, because for many people who have never been in the research and development realm, there might be this reverence for science. But for those of us who have delved into it, now I don't have a PhD or anything like that, but I've delved into, I have a master's degree, I've delved into research. I was in a PhD school, and I stopped halfway. I didn't fail, I just decided not to do it.
Yeah, but you're familiar with the scientific
method, I'm familiar with all that.
Research, development.
Science is a tool. It's a tool. It's a screwdriver. It's a powerful tool that can accomplish many things, just like a screwdriver is a powerful tool. But it's a tool. It's a series of questions and discovery systems and process to achieve different things. It's a tool. It's constantly asking questions. Constantly, when you become draconian and dictate, say this is it, you just became anti-science right there. Because for a while people thought the Earth was flat. For a while people thought only Newtonian physics worked, until they discover quantum mechanics that completely contradicted those things. There's always a process of asking questions and saying, hey, this is what we think it is, but we're not really sure. What's your opinion?
It's rooted in humility.
Humility,
not in arrogance.
Inquisition, asking questions, having an inquisitive mind to say, well, what are your thoughts on this? Are there more data? Are there more things? Are there more discovery? To say, well, this is hardcore, this. To me, that's no longer scientific, because once you close off the discussion, you're saying, hey, we can't use this tool anymore. And then you no longer applying this tool of science when you say this discussion is done. That's why when people are silencing oppositional opinions of science, whatever opinion you have, or saying, hey, you know what, we won't even look at this, you're just crazy, that's not even true. To me, that's you're being unscientific at that point.
Right.
So for someone to say I am science, like, I don't even know how to make of that.
Right.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, and it puts science on one side, and then everything else that wants to have a differing opinion on the other side, and it puts them in conflict. And I think what our listeners need to know is it was Christianity and the principles of Christianity and the Christian worldview that gave rise to science. So this whole idea of faith versus reason or religion versus science being in conflict to each other, like they're juxtaposed, like they're diametrically opposed as enemies of one another. This is a fabrication that is recent. This has not been the way it has been throughout history. In fact, just the opposite has been true. It was the fact that Christians believed that we lived in a universe that was God created, therefore it had meaning. Therefore, it had laws because God was the ultimate lawgiver. In fact, I'm amazed, when you look at some of the early scientists before the technology caught up to what they were doing, they were able, just through mathematics, to predict, lunar cycles and where our planets would be at certain times.
Amazing. It's an amazing tool.
It's unbelievable, and that was just through mathematics.
Yeah.
And then when the scientific development came along, they were able to confirm that their math was actually accurate. So the point is, the reason science flourished in the West and not in the East is because of our worldview. An Eastern worldview did not believe in a world that was predictable, a world that was based on logic, rationality, based on law. It was much more mysterious.
Right. There's no point to establish laws and systems and experimental if you believe everything's random.
That's right.
Your worldview dictates how you, why even establish these elaborate experiments if everything is just based on spirit or whatever random? There's no point to establish that. But when you have a worldview that the world's orderly, the probability does matter, that God created an orderly world, then you'll take the time to establish processes and systems and scientific experiments.
Well, we forget that science uses logic to make sense out of the facts themselves. And so a question we need to ask and go back a little further is, where do you base your validity on logic or reasoning?
Yeah.
I mean, because how do we know that what's going on inside of our brain, which according to evolution is a bunch of random, chemical, experiences that are happening. How do we know that has any correspondence with the external world around us? You don't, unless you believe you're created in the image and likeness of God, and that God is omniscient, God is knowing, God is wise, God is intelligent, God uses reason, and that He's equipped us to engage in this world. In fact, you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, the dominion mandate was really a command by the Lord to Adam and Eve to take dominion over the planet. In other words, to exercise control over nature.
Yeah. There's a bunch of laws that God revealed through the scriptures, and there are a bunch of scientific law that we get to discover on our own.
Right.
So for this to make sense in a very practical way, at least for me, when I learned, as a young child, I learned about probability. It blew my mind. Like if you flip a coin, in general, the more you flip, it's going to be 50-50. That blew my mind. I asked my dad, I said, why is that? What force is causing that 50-50 balance?
Right.
It seems magical to me. And my dad's explanation to me was, that's because God created an orderly world. Now, I just challenge anyone to explain probability 50-50 without some type of orderly being or force. I mean, actually, people do say stuff like the force or something. Yeah. But to me, that almost seems magical. But that's the discovery of scientists figure out how these forces work. And my worldview says that because there's an orderly God behind all of this that ties our world together. In fact, in Colossians, it talks about how Jesus is the force. He's the uniter of all this existence, and that's who Christ is.
We sing that wonderful song, "You hold it all together."
Hold it all together, exactly.
And so when we look back historically at the flow of thought, and sometimes you look at these folks like Newton and some of the giants. Yeah. These were devout Christians, and I want to point out another book that is an amazing book. It's called "The Book That Made Your World: How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization." It's by a man, an Indian man, who is called the C.S. Lewis of India. So he's a great thinker. But in this book, which again I recommend that you read, he refers to a work by Rodney Stark, who is a Christian sociologist, wrote a book called "For the Glory of God." And in that book, he mentions a roster of scientific stars. These are 52 of the leading and most important scientists who pioneered the scientific revolution. And when he studied their beliefs, again, going against this common myth that somehow science and faith are in conflict and that every good scientist is an atheist, he found just the opposite. Out of the 52 major scientific thinkers that are responsible for the scientific revolution, 50 of those men were devout Christians. Only two were skeptics. All right, so they weren't even atheists or agnostics. They were simply skeptics.
Yep.
But the other 50 were deeply devoted Christians, and the reason that they studied the world was because they believed that there were laws God had embedded in nature itself that could be discovered, and that could be discovered for the glory of God. So when you discover the law, you worship because you realize that law didn't get there without a lawgiver. That law did not just become a law by itself. That law is a law because a greater power, God Almighty, was the one that created that law and put it in the fabric of the universe. And so science was something that was done for the glory of God and with great passion and great zeal and great enthusiasm because you believed that there was something to look for. You know, in other words, there's something to find as you pursued it. But talk about the modern war, because Colson gives kind of a little bit of a history of some of the thought that led us to where we're at today, you know, to where science has greatly outstepped its boundaries and become actually a religion.
Well, just like anything, any other counterfeit redemption, science fills that void nicely. You know?
Yeah.
It's a powerful force. It's a powerful tool. It's a powerful. It stirs the imagination of mankind. You know, I mean, when you list to some of these these important figures, Francis Bacon, 16th century. It's kind of with the advent of industrial revolutions and science is advancing, and people are like, wow, this is really powerful. You know, he created this. Is this a fiction, a new Atlantis, or is this?
Yeah, it was a fictional book that he wrote. But in that work, he conceived of this giant laboratory where the world's problems would be all solved through science, and that we could actually, you know, that whole escalator myth, right? Yeah. We're going to keep progressing to higher levels. So the main centerpiece of the new Atlantis was a scientific laboratory full of white-coated Dr. Fauci's who are going to save the world of all of its problems. And then you move to August Comte.
But just on Francis Bacon real quick. Again, his utopia. Let's go back to utopianism, right? Yep. Is that, you know, whatever problem has will be solved by a bunch of people using the scientific method. Now that sounds intriguing because we have created many tools using the scientific method. Yeah. But to solve all the world's problem, again, on surface, it sounds so good, right? It sounds like, well, we solved how to make a man fly on the airplane through this, you know, through the scientific method. Let's apply this to every problem we have and see what happens. We'll talk about
there should be an excitement about scientific breakthrough and creating solutions to people's problems. But when you do that apart from God, that's when you get into great danger.
Well, it's when you transcend the boundaries of words. Again, this is all going back to the idea of boundaries. Yeah. The boundaries that God gives us are good. Okay, and when we try to break those boundaries, we're going into a lot of trouble. And so this is when science transcends its boundaries. Yes. Okay, it's a good thing. So let's keep going. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the next major theorist was Auguste Comte, the 19th century founder of sociology. And his theory is very popular today, that societies are evolving and going through different stages. And what he said was the most primitive societies are basically theological. They're rooted in theology and a belief in the supernatural. And then as you mature, then you move into a metaphysical understanding where you have philosophers and rationalism and all this kind of stuff, a society based on thinkers. And then you advance to the third stage, which he said was a scientific stage that was marked by scientific experimentation. And so even now today, you know, I noticed this, for instance, when churches opened up in the midst of COVID and we said, hey, you know, we're just going to believe that Jesus still heals. We're going to believe that we need to be open to love people, care for people, pray for people, and be the church. You had this whole tribe that was basically saying, even in the church, that almost has adopted this belief that, you know, well, those beliefs are primitive because they're supernatural and they're theological. We should be, you know, closing our building and relying on scientific data because the science is telling us to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. I mean, this is the same faulty belief system. And you brought out a good point. Really, the opposite is true. Science is very limited in its scope. Then you move into the realm of ideas, and then ultimately you live in the realm of what, the revelation. Thus saith the Lord.
Yeah, for me, the scientific observation is based on your senses. And to be able to see and read a chart and look at the computer data, I mean, anybody can do that. Now, I'm not saying anyone can design those experiments. That's very difficult and takes a lot of rigor. But the observation of receiving those information is very, everyone can do that. A higher level will be the metaphysical, philosophical, because now you're thinking deeper things, you're asking deeper questions, you're asking deeper things, and then the highest level to me of information is revelation. It's through the Holy Spirit.
Thus saith the Lord.
It's through conviction of your heart. It's through a change of heart. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit later, because the science cannot change someone's heart, which we'll get to.
And the great scientists of old believe that there were two books that we could read from. One was the book of Revelation, thus saith the Lord. The other was the book of nature that God created and created it, for His glory. Yep. And so you use those two books, nature and Revelation. Well, we've thrown out Revelation with the scriptures, but it was actually in the Bible that a lot of the foundational ideas for science, when they would read scripture, they go, wait a minute. The Bible says this about reality or about the universe, and then they would go explore that, and they'd find out, wow, sure enough, that's true. Yep. Some of the things that the Holy Spirit revealed in the Scriptures were centuries ahead of scientific development. And so, we talk about Comte, then we move to probably the biggest one, which is Darwin. Darwin's theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, was a game changer because he basically tried to provide a scientific explanation that didn't require God for how
origin of life and species and all that jazz. Yep.
But then the next step from that was genetic engineering. And talk a little bit about that, because that's really where much of science is at right now.
Well, what Darwin does, he demystified life. Life is no longer a miracle. It's a scientific process. You throw a bunch of I don't even think he really delved into the origins. Other scientists did that. He kind of talked about the speciation, but he put the idea in. Right. But the point is, if life came from a test tube, if you could create life in a test tube, we are no different from anything else.
Right.
There's nothing sacred about life, an intrinsic sacredness about life, which causes all kind of social issues, right? That in itself. But out of that comes genetic engineering.
Right.
Because again, once you remove the sacredness of life, now we're saying, hey, everything is can be manipulated, changed, moved. We're just all part of the grand scheme of nature, manipulating things. Why don't we be in charge, and why don't we start manipulation? Yeah,
it's kind of that. So the little man in the white coat in the lab now becomes a creator, because this is where it gets to be really heady and full of pride and arrogance. Is now we start saying, wait. Let's, through genetic engineering, let's try to create a better human being. Let's try to create a healthier, stronger, more moral human being. In other words, let's through simply manipulation of genetic code, let's actually create a new man in our image and likeness.
Yeah, and that sounds all great and noble, but the truth is you make man a commodity. Because again, cows are commodities. Dogs are commodities, right? Dairy cow and a pig and a turkey, they're commodities. Right. If we're all just the same, there's nothing sacredness, intrinsically valuable, made image and likeness of God, of man, then we're just commodity. Why don't we just modify? We would genetically modify, clone sheep and modify chickens, and so, it sounds all noble, want to make a newer man, but inevitably man becomes another commodity. Your children becomes commodity, newborns, and where does that go? And there's a lot of horror films or dystopia movies made of that idea. Right. When you make man a commodity.
Right. And then Colson points out that so there's all this euphoria over genetic engineering and about what the future looks like, but then you have theorists like Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist who was an atheist, who said, we're not evolving fast enough. Human beings are going to blow up the planet. The problems are too great. Human nature is too wicked. I don't know that he would use the word wicked, but in other words, we got too many problems. We're not evolving fast enough. And so, interestingly enough, I always found this amusing. Mm-hmm. Some of these folks that are most pessimistic are looking to extraterrestrials as the solution. So Hawking believed that we needed to search the universe for aliens who were farther advanced than we were. And in fact, the two guys that who discovered the double helix.
Francis Crick, in particular, he won the Nobel Prize for discovering the structured DNA. He actually believed that he looked at structured DNA. He's like, this is too complex for natural or whatever.
Couldn't happen by accident.
So he actually believed it was seeded from aliens. So right now, throughout Hollywood, you see the different ideas of this idea that we're seeded from other planets. So now there's a pursuit of. So there's a craving of saying, hey, what we see on the diversity, the complexity of the world, can't come from just what we from nature itself. And we cannot save ourselves. We need something external. And that sounds kind of familiar, right?
Right.
However, their solution, instead of looking for the revelation through religion, what we call religion, a God that actually holds us accountable for our morals and says, you know what, you belong to me, and the world's, it's for my glory. They look for external force such as ET, because to me the reason ET is more convenient is because to them, ET doesn't require moral, the level of accountability.
I just find it interesting that our worldview solves all these problems. We have a God who created us, a God who helps define us, a God who created an orderly world that we could take dominion, and a God who explains the crisis of human nature, that it's not our genetics that's the problem, it's our hearts that's the problem. And the answer is outside of ourselves. It's God sending his son Jesus. And yet,
the original ET.
They reject all of that, right? They reject all of that, but they end up at the same place. They end up saying, "Oh my gosh, our problems are too great. Yes, we can save ourselves, but we need help. We need somebody out there in the universe." And that's why it cracks me up. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, which is a massive organization,
array,
listening for any kind of feedback out there in the universe, because we believe that there's got to be extraterrestrials out there to save us.
They talk about Carl Sagan is one of the guys who's like major into this, and he wrote a book called Contact, and they made it into the movie. And when I saw the movie, it has Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey, and I really enjoyed the movie. And when I watched this movie, I was a younger kid. I didn't understand all the subtext. I didn't know all the politics behind it. I didn't get all that. Okay, but when I watched the movie, I was like, wow. They demonstrate worship and religion and faith like no other. I mean, I challenge you to watch that movie, and like there was this couple scenes I actually showed to my youth group back when I was back in Virginia, and I said, hey, here's a picture of worship. Here's a picture of faith. I mean, the inner, I don't
secularized faith, but faith.
But the longing for somebody to worship, the longing for someone to see something so beautiful, you're like, wow, I have to worship them. The longing to go and make a leap of faith to say, hey, I have to know what is reality like. The longing to believe in something even though it doesn't make sense. Like these are scientists who long for faith. Why is that? Why is this longing to say, hey, science is not enough? Because you're going to cover right here. Because these scientists, as they dig deep into science, they realize scientism in itself is an empty black hole in terms of really fulfilling the desires of our heart.
You shared a word that I think is important to highlight. There's a difference between science and scientism. Scientism is when you make a religion out of science. It's when science becomes your God. It's when you take science out of its proper boundaries. And I wanted to highlight just several of the limitations of science, because it helps put science back, as Pastor Andrew said, in the proper boundaries, to where it's useful, to where it doesn't become an idol that we worship. Yeah. These are the limits of science. Science has to deal with only observable, measurable phenomena. We know that there are, from a Christian worldview, reality is not limited just to what is observable or what is measurable. God is not observable or measurable, for instance. Human thoughts are not observable or measurable. There's a lot of reality that we experience that does not fit in what is observable and measurable.
I mean, just look at human nature today. Like, if the observable world is all we have, that's only grasp of reality. Why is there such longing for the unobservable throughout culture? People call the opium in the masses. I just say it's human nature, because deep in our hearts we know there's something beyond just simply what's observable.
That's right. The materialistic world by itself does not satisfy who we are. Secondly, science can describe but not explain. So again, science gives you data, but it takes a scientist to explain the data, and that scientist is going to be operating out of his or her worldview. And so Like, again, you take a scientist who does not believe in God, does not believe in the supernatural, does not believe in a Christian worldview. They're going to look at the same data, and because of their bias, their worldview bias, they're going to have a limited understanding of how to interpret that data. Whereas a Christian who has a wider, a bigger toolkit, let's just say, as it relates to epistemology or how we know what we know.
Right.
We have a broader explanatory basis than someone who's just a scientist who's a naturalist.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you specifically what does that look like. So when I was in grad school, my professor would help me because he does peer review for other research. So he'll invite me to go and give my opinion. So he'll give me a paper, read it, give me a peer review, okay? So basically, I read a lot of research paper. That's not mine, other people's research. And basically, the only part that's really scientific is the data.
Yeah.
But even the data could be biased because you can structure data in a certain way. But say the data is unbiased.
Yeah.
Okay. You read the data, they present the data. That's a result section, and afterward there's a conclusion section.
Right.
The conclusion section is basically completely subjective. Is the scientist saying I look at the data and based on this data I theorize. In other words, I'm interpreting, I'm guessing it's because of this. That's just another person's opinion. The data itself, first of all, is subjective because you got to repeat it a bunch of times. It could be different conditions. You can talk about different control, all these different things. Yep. So there's subjectivity on the data, and there's great subjectivity on the conclusion part. In fact,
which causes you to be humble, and which is why it leads to the next point. You have to be able to repeat the results.
Yep.
And that keeps you humble again, because if you get a certain set of data that can't be repeated, then it's probably not a good experiment, right? Science, it's not good science. Right. If something's established as a law, for instance, it should be able to be repeatable over and over.
Well, but even that, okay, so when they say it's a scientific law, say gravity, well, how does that get established? That's basically saying the data gets repeated a bunch of times, and many scientists, through the conclusion part, agree that this is the reason why.
Right.
But is that truly reality? Not necessarily, because later new data may come, new interpretation comes.
Science always deals with probabilities, plus or minus and all that kind of stuff, right? Yep. So even at the end of the day, science never makes a definitive statement. It says this is what we see.
This is probably what happened. But I just want to say scientific law. I mean, people used to say the sun revolved around the earth. That was a scientific law. I mean, these are things that has been disproven after it becomes a law. So nothing. So there's such humility that we need to be when we interpret science.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so again, no experiment can be completely controlled. Observations, as you just pointed out, could be faulty. Mm-hmm. A man's belief affects his judgment. Mm-hmm. So if you don't believe in a supernatural explanation, you'll never find one and you'll never look for one. Science must deal with repeatable results, as we mentioned, and this last one is really huge, and you touched on it. Science cannot deal with values or morals. One of my college professors used to say this: you can never get an ought from an is. In other words, science tells you what is. Here's the data. But science can never tell you what you ought to do. That's a moral judgment. That's beyond the scope of science. Mm-hmm. And that's where today, and maybe we can close here, but today we're finding all kinds of conflicts with genuine science with what ought to be done with that science. For instance, there's more proof now in the sanctity of human life, and that a baby is a human being at conception, and now we have all the sonograph, or what's the word? Sonograph. Anyway, they've got 3D, 4D, where you can literally see the expression of that baby's face in the womb. I mean, there's more scientific and technological data now to show that baby is just that. It's not a fetus. It is a human being, and it should be protected. And yet we're still arguing about science as it relates to sanctity of life.
That's a great example. So the data. What does the data show? The data shows that the baby's fully formed as this phase.
Can feel pain.
She can feel pain in
sucks
the face.
its thumb.
But then interpretation is where it goes to different people's worldview, which is fine. But don't call your conclusion science.
Right, at that
it's
point,
your interpretation of your worldview. So for your worldview says, you know what, human life is blah 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 blah. Therefore we're born. That's not science. That's worldview. Now my interpretation is, hey, the data shows me that they are alive and they're independent life at this stage. So again, when people say this is science, I'm like it doesn't make any sense. It's your interpretation of the data.
Or we talk about forced mandates. It's one thing to say this vaccine is a good vaccine. Okay, well, that's an interpretation of the vaccine
the data,
as well.
Yeah.
There are others that would argue, well, I'm not so sure about that. And then when you get into science is telling us that we all need to be vaccinated, now you've just jumped over. That's not science telling you that. That's somebody's worldview telling you that.
Right.
Yeah. And so, this whole idea, maybe we just conclude here that somehow a little man in a white jacket in some lab has the authority to tell our nation and all of the citizens of this great nation what we should and shouldn't be doing, and then base that authority on science is very, very scary and troubling.
Well,
and,
let me just say an example. Okay, so what does science tell us? Is it better to sacrifice one life for many? Or is it okay to spare one life for the sake of many? I mean, these are the questions that science cannot answer, right? Statistically, you can say, well, if you sacrifice one person, you can say statistically, you can give us the data, but science is not going to give you the alt, right?
Right.
And that's the question that's been answered all the time. Like, what's better, according to the science of vaccination, personal freedom, personal liberty?
Sure.
These are difficult constitutional identity
So we get
questions.
back to our point about primitive versus mature civilizations. Actually, we just turned everything on its head, because we're talking about the deepest questions in life are fundamentally religious and philosophical. They're not scientific.
Can't answer that for us.
And so that's why we need to be rooted in the question of ethics. Where does our authority come from? And for us as Christians, thus saith the Lord is the highest level of authority that we can appeal.
And I would even argue that historically, in more recent history, people have used the name of science, this is science, to commit things, horrible things, because that's scientific.
We can go back to World War II and the Nazis and some of the horrific.
I mean,
things
people have
that
used the name of religion to do horrible. I mean, I'm just saying, but science is right up there. You know,
absolutely.
It's just another interpretation. This is my interpretation, but I'm going to call it science.
Absolutely. So anyway, these are counterfeit redeemers, and as we're approaching the holidays here with Christmas just around the corner, I think it's great to remember that God sent His Son into this world to redeem a people for Himself. Any other counterfeit besides Jesus Christ as Lord is just that. It is a counterfeit. It's not going to lead to freedom and liberty. It's going to lead to bondage and death. And so thank God for sending Jesus, and thank God for His Son, and thank God for all that Jesus accomplished through His sinless life and His death and His resurrection for us. Jesus is the Redeemer, and Jesus is the one that makes all of this make sense. And so I encourage you, continue to press into Him and continue to press into developing your Christian worldview, because I really believe in the superiority of our worldview, because it's based on truth and it fits reality better than any other worldview. And so as you're processing through all the science arguments today, I hope this podcast has been helpful. I hope it gives you some things some tools in your toolkit that you can use to share the gospel winsomely to your neighbors who might be under this delusion that somehow science is at odds with Jesus and with the gospel. So, hey, have a great week. We look forward to getting back with you next week. Don't forget Friday night to join us here at the church for an amazing Christmas celebration. And come on out on Sunday. We meet at 8:30, 10 o'clock, and 11:45 here at Living Stones. And the facility will look like a winter wonderland as we get ready to celebrate Christmas. All right, so we look forward to seeing you hopefully this week. God bless you guys.